A crowd of 3,000 people, a single gunshot. And in the half second after it cracked through the air, a police officer's mind went somewhere unexpected, not to the man later accused of pulling the trigger, but to an empty holster lying in the grass, feet away from where chaos was unfolding. That officer would later testify that everything about that moment felt wrong. The sound wasn't right. A handgun, he knew from years of training, produces a short, sharp pop. What tore through the courtyard that afternoon was longer, heavier, more violent, the unmistakable signature of a rifle. And yet there it was. A pistol holster, empty, discarded on the ground, as if daring investigators to draw the wrong conclusion. For a few critical minutes, they nearly did. Months later, inside a Provo, Utah courtroom, that same disorienting confusion resurfaced, this time in front of the people who loved Charlie Kirk the most. His widow sat in the front row for the first time since his death, close enough to see the man accused of ending her husband's life. She would not stay for all of it. When prosecutors moved to play video evidence of the shooting itself, she rose and walked out, unable to watch what the rest of the room could not see, either because the footage was shown only to the judge, hidden from the public and the press entirely. What remained visible was the judge's face. Witnesses in the gallery would later describe watching him flinch, almost recoil, at whatever appeared on that screen. No one else knew exactly what triggered it. They only knew that something in those frames was bad enough to unsettle a man who had likely seen his share of disturbing evidence before. This is the story of how a university campus, one so open, so unguarded, that a person could reportedly walk up a public staircase, step over a low gate, and stand on a rooftop with a clear line of sight to a stage below, became the site of a political assassination that shocked the country. It's the story of 6 campus police officers tasked with securing an event that drew thousands. Of a rifle shot mistaken for a fatal handful of seconds, for something else entirely, and of a courtroom now forced to reckon with just how much went wrong before anyone ever pulled a trigger. Before we go further, I want to be upfront with you. This case involves graphic details surrounding a real act of violence, and some of what's discussed in this video may be disturbing. If you're sensitive to that kind of content, please take care of yourself as you watch. If this is your first time here, welcome to CAC Crime Trending. We cover real cases with care, accuracy, and respect for the people affected by them. Hit subscribe if you want to follow this case as it develops, and drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Seconds after the gunshot, a campus police officer looked down and saw something that didn't belong. An empty pistol holster, lying flat in the grass with no owner in sight. In the middle of a crowd scrambling in every direction, that one detail stopped him. His training told him something wasn't right. The sound he just heard was too long, too heavy, too violent to have come from a handgun. A pistol cracked short and flat. What tore across that courtyard seconds earlier had the drawn-out signature of a rifle. And yet here he was, staring at a holster with nothing in it. For a few critical minutes, that contradiction sent the response in the wrong direction. An older man near the scene was detained, treated briefly as the person responsible. He wasn't. While officers worked to make sense of a holster that didn't match the sound of the shot, the real gunman was still on campus and still free. Charlie Kirk built his public career on a format most political figures avoided, standing in front of college students who disagreed with him and taking their questions live, unscripted, one after another. He co-founded Turning Point USA, an organization aimed at organizing conservative students on campuses nationwide, and that open debate format became his signature. He didn't just speak at colleges, he argued with them, on camera, week after week. That format is exactly what brought him to Utah Valley University on the 10th of September 2025. It was a stop on a college tour built around the same premise that had defined his career for over a decade. Set up a stage in the middle of campus, open the floor, and let students challenge him directly. By that point, Kirk's influence extended well beyond any single campus visit. Turning Point USA had grown into one of the most recognized youth political organizations in the country, credited by allies with helping drive turnout among younger conservative voters in recent election cycles. Whatever people thought of his politics, his reach among that demographic was not in question. Away from the podium, he walked onto that stage at UVU the same way he had at dozens of others. A crowd gathered, the microphones went live, and the questions began. Nothing about that afternoon looked different from any other stop on the tour, until it wasn't. By early afternoon, Roughly 3,000 people had gathered in the outdoor courtyard at Utah Valley University, filling the amphitheater-style space built into the campus layout. It was the same open Q&A format Kirk had run for years. A student stood to ask a question. Kirk began to answer it. Partway through his response, a single shot suddenly rang out across the courtyard, and he was struck. What followed wasn't panic in the abstract sense. It was 3,000 people trying to process gunfire at once, with no clear direction to run, no announcement telling them where the danger actually was. One investigator would later describe those first minutes in court using a specific phrase, organized chaos. Officers were simultaneously managing a stampede, searching for a shooter whose location no one had confirmed, and trying to get medical attention to Kirk, all inside the same 60 seconds. The confusion over the pistol holster in the grass briefly pulled focus toward the wrong person, an older man detained near the scene. That lead collapsed fast. He hadn't fired anything, and once officers recognized the sound they'd heard didn't match a handgun at all, their attention shifted upward, toward the buildings ringing the courtyard, looking for a vantage point instead of a ground-level shooter. It didn't take long to find one. Investigators identified a rooftop with a direct, unobstructed sightline down into the amphitheater, and evidence at that location would soon point them toward a name they hadn't had an hour earlier, Tyler Robinson. At this stage, he wasn't a confirmed shooter. He was a name attached to a location, and a location attached to physical evidence investigators hadn't yet had time to fully process. What they found on that rooftop, and in the wooded area just beyond it, would end up forming the foundation of the entire case built against him. But that part of the investigation was only just beginning to take shape. For now, all officers had was a name, a rooftop, and the first pieces of evidence starting to surface in the minutes after the shot was fired. The rooftop investigators zeroed in on wasn't hidden or hard to reach. It sat at the end of an elevated walkway connecting two campus buildings, a route students used every single day to move between classes. The only thing separating that walkway from the roof itself was a low gate, the kind of barrier a person could step over in seconds without drawing any real attention. There was no locked door to bypass, no climb, no obstacle that required planning beyond simply walking up a public staircase and continuing past a fence that wasn't built to stop anyone determined to cross it. That ease of access wasn't an accident of one overlooked gate. It reflected a much larger security gap around the entire event. Utah Valley University's police department covers a campus with tens of thousands of students, but only 6 officers were assigned to work an event expected to draw a crowd in the thousands. There were no metal detectors set up at any entry point. There was no drone coverage monitoring the rooftops or walkways surrounding the courtyard. And under Utah law, the campus itself wasn't a gun-free zone, meaning anyone in that crowd, in theory, could have been legally carrying a firearm, which only widened the range of possibilities investigators had to rule out in those first confused minutes. In the hours after the shooting, 3 items recovered from 2 separate locations became the physical backbone of the case. In a wooded area near campus, investigators found a bolt-action rifle, deliberately wrapped in a towel. On the rooftop itself, in the exact spot with a direct line of sight down into the amphitheater, they recovered a screwdriver left behind in what appeared to be a rushed departure rather than a careful one. Neither item, on its own, proved who had been standing on that roof. A rifle wrapped in a towel could belong to anyone who'd hidden it there. A screwdriver could have been dropped by a maintenance worker weeks earlier. What made these 3 pieces of evidence significant wasn't their location alone, but what forensic testing would eventually be able to pull from their surfaces. That process would take real-time, lab work, and weeks of careful analysis before investigators could say with any scientific certainty whose hands had touched them. For now, all 3 pieces sat at the center of an expanding investigation. A low gate that made a rooftop shot possible. A rifle that had been carried away from the scene and hidden rather than left behind, and a screwdriver that placed someone, specifically, in that exact position above the crowd. What those items would eventually reveal was still weeks away from being confirmed. While investigators processed the rooftop and the wooded area beyond it, a second thread of evidence was developing entirely separate from the physical scene. It started with a text message. On the morning of the shooting, Tyler Robinson allegedly sent a message to his roommate, Lance Twiggs, telling him to stop what he was doing and check under a keyboard back at the home they shared. Twiggs did. Underneath it, he found a handwritten letter, addressed not to his given name but to a nickname the two reportedly used privately for each other, Luna. The letter read like something written by someone who expected not to come home. It apologized in advance, explained a text had already been sent as an automatic warning, and stated plainly that its author expected to end up dead or facing years in prison. Investigators say the letter described what its author had allegedly just done, closing with a line confirming an opportunity had been taken. That letter reframed the case. Up to that point, everything investigators had was physical: a gate, a rifle, a screwdriver, a rooftop. None of it, by itself, spoke to intent or motive. The letter did. It suggested planning, a level of premeditation physical evidence alone couldn't establish. And it introduced Twiggs, previously an unknown name, directly into the center of the investigation. Separately, search warrant records point to a Discord conversation among a small group of friends that same day. In it, one person reacted to the news with visible shock, a message that read less like someone confirming a plan and more like someone learning about it for the first time. That detail matters. It's one of the clearer signs suggesting this wasn't a plot shared widely among Robinson's circle if it was shared with anyone beyond Twiggs. With this letter, this text, and this reaction, the case had shifted. It was no longer just a question of who had access to a rooftop. It was a question of what was going on inside the mind of the person who used it, and how much another person may have known. The forensic science behind all of this, what the rifle, the towel, and the screwdriver would reveal under lab analysis, is where this case gets its most concrete answers. That's coming up next. If you want it the moment it's ready, this is a good point to subscribe. Before any letter, any DNA result, or any confession, investigators had already started building a timeline from something far more mundane: campus surveillance footage. Pulled from cameras across Utah Valley University, the footage showed a gray Dodge Charger entering and leaving campus 4 separate times over the course of that day, twice before the shooting, once around the time of the shooting itself, and once again later that evening. The person driving it was visible across multiple clips, wearing a dark red t-shirt, dark shorts, sneakers, and a baseball cap, carrying a backpack. Investigators traced his movements through ordinary parts of a Tuesday. He walked past event staff and briefly spoke with members of Turning Point USA's team, the same organization running Kirk's event. At one point, he stopped and bought food at a Chick-fil-A on campus, behaving, by every visual account, like someone with nowhere urgent to be. Later footage showed the same individual without the backpack he'd been carrying earlier. Investigators noted the change. They didn't need to explain it. The absence spoke for itself, and it lined up with what would later be found wrapped in a towel in the wooded area nearby. For 36 hours after the shooting, that was where the trail sat. A car, a description, a pattern of movement, but no name attached to any of it publicly. That changed when the man now identified as Tyler Robinson turned himself in, not to police who tracked him down, but voluntarily at a sheriff's office in St. George, roughly 200 miles from campus. He didn't arrive alone. A family friend named Mitchell helped facilitate the surrender after Robinson's own family had confronted him with what they'd pieced together on their own. Whatever conversation happened inside that family in the hours beforehand, it ended with Robinson walking into the Washington County Sheriff's Office rather than continuing to run. From there, the process moved quickly and procedurally. Robinson's phone was seized. Investigators collected a DNA swab, fingerprints, and handprints. He was transported back to Utah County under guard and booked into jail in the early morning hours of September 12th, roughly a day and a half after the shot that started this entire investigation. What happened next wouldn't be decided by surveillance footage or a surrender. It would come down to a lab and to what 3 pieces of physical evidence could scientifically prove. Weeks after the rifle, the towel, and the screwdriver were logged into evidence, FBI lab results came back, and they gave prosecutors the single strongest physical link in the entire case. DNA testing conducted across all 3 items identified 2 distinct profiles: Tyler Robinson and his roommate, Lance Twiggs. Not just one profile, 2, present together on the same objects recovered from 2 different locations tied to the shooting. The certainty behind that match wasn't presented in vague terms. On at least one item tested, analysts testified the DNA profile was roughly 30 quintillion times more likely to belong to Robinson and Twiggs than to have occurred by any kind of coincidence. That's a number built specifically to eliminate reasonable doubt about whose hands had been on that evidence. A figure so large it functions less like a probability and more like a fingerprint in numerical form. But DNA on an object only proves contact with the object. It doesn't, by itself, prove who pulled a trigger, and that gap is exactly where Robinson's defense has focused its strongest counterargument. Ballistics testing conducted by the ATF was unable to conclusively match the bullet fragment recovered from Kirk's autopsy to the rifle investigators recovered near campus. In court filings, defense attorneys have leaned hard on that inconclusive result, arguing it means the state's own forensic experts can't fully connect the recovered weapon to the fatal shot. Prosecutors haven't let that argument stand unchallenged. Their response points to the other half of the same report. The ATF also couldn't rule the rifle out. Inconclusive, in their framing, doesn't mean cleared. It means the science, at least on this narrow point, simply couldn't reach a definitive answer in either direction, and they argue the defense's characterization of that finding leaves out the part that doesn't help their case. This dispute isn't a side issue. It's arguably the single sharpest scientific disagreement in the entire proceeding, and it's likely to resurface at trial with far more weight than it carries at a preliminary hearing, where the burden on prosecutors is comparatively low. DNA places Robinson and Twiggs in contact with evidence connected to the shooting. It does not, on its own, place a rifle in Robinson's hands at the moment the trigger was pulled. That's the distinction the defense is building its case around, and it's the distinction prosecutors are working to close. For now, both claims remain technically true at the same time. The DNA match is scientifically overwhelming. The ballistics match is scientifically incomplete. How a jury eventually weighs those two facts against each other, rather than how either side chooses to frame them outside the courtroom, is likely to become one of the defining questions of this case once it reaches trial. None of this forensic detail exists in a vacuum, though. It's being argued, contested, and ruled on inside an actual courtroom, in front of an actual judge, and that setting is where this case takes its next major turn. Presiding over all of it is 4th District Judge Tony Graff, who is tasked with deciding two separate but connected questions: whether there's enough evidence for this case to go to trial at all, and whether it proceeds with the death penalty on the table. Robinson's defense is handled by a team of 3 attorneys, Catherine Nestor, Richard Novak, and Stacey Visser, who have spent months filing motions aimed at narrowing what evidence the public and a future jury pool ever get to see. That fight over public exposure hasn't been limited to defense filings. Earlier this year, Utah County Prosecutor Christopher Ballard was held in civil contempt of court after making public comments a judge ruled violated a gag order restricting what either side could say outside the courtroom. Ballard had spoken to reporters about an ATF ballistics report, and in doing so, also characterized the overall strength of the state's case in a way the judge found risked influencing a future jury pool. The contempt finding didn't actually touch the case's core evidence. It was about what prosecutors are and aren't allowed to say publicly while the case remains active. One of the more consequential rulings so far involves Lance Twiggs. Rather than testifying live, a recorded interview he gave in April was played for the court instead. The defense pushed back hard, arguing they had a constitutional right to cross-examine him directly, rather than respond to a recording. Judge Graff disagreed, explaining that a preliminary hearing isn't the stage where that right applies. Cross-examination, he ruled, comes at trial. He trimmed portions he determined were hearsay or not relevant, but the substance of Twiggs' statement was allowed to stand as evidence. Much of the argument inside that courtroom isn't really about whether Robinson was on that rooftop. It's about why, because prosecutors are trying to establish an aggravating circumstance that could make Robinson eligible for the death penalty, specifically, that he targeted Kirk because of his political views. The defense has objected to how that claim is framed, arguing prosecutors are blurring the line between political motive and Kirk's religious beliefs in a way that could mislead a jury about what this case is actually about. So far, Judge Graff has allowed prosecutors to continue building that argument. The people sitting in the gallery have made this hearing look different from every proceeding that preceded it. Robinson's parents have attended nearly every court date since his arrest. This time, Kirk's widow, Erica Kirk, and his parents, Robert and Catherine Kirk, were present for the first time, close enough to see the man accused of killing him. Donald Trump Jr., a friend of Kirk's, sat in the gallery as well. At points, when testimony turned toward the moments just before the shooting, Kirk's parents and widow stepped out. They came back once that portion had passed. None of what happens inside that room settles guilt or innocence. That's not what this hearing is for. What it does is set the terms for everything that comes next. Whether Robinson stands trial, and whether the state gets to argue for the harshest sentence Utah law allows. Both decisions are close to being finalized, and what they ultimately mean for Robinson, and for this case, is where the story goes next. Robinson faces 10 separate charges total. The weight of this case comes down to one of them. Aggravated murder is the most serious, a capital offense under Utah law, meaning a conviction could carry either life without parole or death. The remaining 9 include discharge of a firearm causing injury, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, 2 counts of witness tampering, and a count tied to committing a violent offense in the presence of a child. Robinson has not entered a plea on any of them. Once this hearing concludes, Judge Graff decides whether Robinson is bound over for trial. That phrase means the judge found reasonable grounds to believe Robinson committed the crimes he's been charged with. It's a lower bar than the standard a jury will apply. Reasonable grounds is not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that gap is exactly what the coming trial exists to close. Several threads remain genuinely open. The ballistics gap between the recovered rifle and the bullet fragment hasn't been resolved, only argued. Lance Twiggs' full role, cooperating witness or something closer to an unindicted participant, is still being shaped by rulings the judge hasn't finished making. And jury selection will be its own battle, given how much of this case has already played out publicly in a live-stream courtroom. What's clear is that a preliminary hearing was never going to be the end of this story. It was always the beginning of the part where evidence gets tested in front of a jury instead of a judge, where cross-examination replaces recorded statements, and where the death penalty question moves from a legal possibility to an actual decision that 12 people will have to make. We'll be covering every stage of that as it happens, from the trial date once it's set to the verdict and sentencing whenever they come. If accuracy matters to you as much as it matters to us, subscribing is how you'll get it the moment it's confirmed, not the moment it starts trending. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.